The rain had not stopped for 3 weeks. It was a relentless, punishing deluge that had turned the normally placid Oakhaven River into a violent, churning artery of brown water, and the entire valley into a drowning basin. At the absolute lowest point of this geographical bowl sat Blackwood Farm, a sprawling tract of once fertile land that had belonged to the Blackwood family since the late 19th century. Now it was a lake. Arthur Blackwood stood at the edge of his submerged back porch, the icy water lapping at the rubber of his worn, knee-high boots. At 78 years old, his face was a map of the land he had worked his entire life, deeply lined, weathered by decades of sun and wind, and currently set in a grim, immovable scowl. He wore a heavy, faded green wool coat that smelled faintly of wet dog and old motor oil, the collar pulled up against the biting chill of the gray morning. Underneath the churning surface of the floodwaters lay his winter wheat, his meticulously maintained topsoil, and the legacy of 3 generations. The Oakhaven Dam, 20 miles upstream, had reached its absolute capacity 5 days ago. The emergency spillways had been opened, sending a torrent down into the valley. Every farm suffered, but geography dictated that Blackwood Farm would suffer the most. It was the valley's drain, the final resting place for millions of gallons of displaced water. Arthur performed his morning ritual, a bleak exercise in measuring devastation. He waded out to the wooden fence post that usually separated the garden from the lower pasture. He had carved notches into the rotting wood over the past week. The water was up another 2 inches since yesterday evening. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation of the earth. He felt a profound, crushing weight in his chest, a mixture of ancestral guilt and personal failure. He had promised his father on his deathbed that he would keep the farm producing, keep the soil turning. He was the last Blackwood on this land, and under his watch, it was returning to the primordial swamp from which his grandfather had wrested it. The low, throbbing hum of heavy diesel engines broke the monotonous drumming of the rain. Arthur turned his head, squinting through the mist. Crawling down the submerged county road, their massive tires throwing up rooster-tails of muddy water, was a convoy of pristine white trucks. Emblazoned on their sides in stark, aggressive blue lettering was the logo, FloodTech Solutions, Advanced Disaster Mitigation. The county, in a state of emergency panic, had bypassed the local engineering corps and hired private contractors from out of state. They were the modern cavalry, armed not with shovels and sandbags, but with algorithms and heavy industry. The lead vehicle, a massive mobile command center that looked more suited for a military invasion than an agricultural rescue, splashed to a halt on the slight incline of Arthur's driveway, the only patch of land still marginally above the waterline. The doors opened and out stepped the FloodTech crew. They moved with a rehearsed, urgent efficiency, wearing matching waterproof gear and high-visibility vests. Leading them was Samuel Davis, a senior project manager whose pristine uniform and crisp, peaked cap stood in sharp contrast to the muddy devastation surrounding him. Davis looked to be in his mid-40s, sharp-featured, with eyes that scanned the landscape not with empathy, but with the calculating gaze of a man reading a spreadsheet. He clutched a ruggedized tablet, his thumb already swiping through topographical maps and weather telemetry. Arthur trudged up the incline to meet them, the mud sucking at his boots with every step. "Mr. Blackwood?" Davis asked, his voice projecting easily over the sound of the rain and idling engines. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders and receiving immediate compliance. "Samuel Davis, FloodTech. The county sent us to bail you out." Arthur merely nodded, extending a calloused, dirt-stained hand. Davis took it briefly, his grip firm but sterile. "It's a mess, son," Arthur rasped, his voice gravelly from disuse and the damp air. "Water's got nowhere to go. The water table is fully saturated, clear down to the bedrock." Davis offered a tight, patronizing smile. He tapped his tablet. "With all due respect, sir, we aren't relying on gravity and hope. We've mapped the entire subsurface geography with ground-penetrating radar drones this morning. We've got 4 12-inch diesel-driven centrifugal pumps rolling in behind us. We're going to establish a rapid dewatering perimeter, push the volume back over the levee ridge to the north, and force drain the topsoil." "Over the north ridge?" Arthur frowned, pointing a gnarled finger toward the distant, unseen tree line. "That's a 50-foot grade, and the ground beneath this field ain't just dirt. There's a shelf of Oakhaven shale about 30 feet down. It's hard as iron and sits right on top of a pressurized aquifer. You pull too hard, you're gonna upset the balance." Davis's smile remained fixed, but his eyes glazed over slightly, the universal look of an expert indulging a layman. "I appreciate the local insight, Mr. Blackwood, but our subterranean saturation metrics indicate the shale layer is heavily fractured. It shouldn't impede the high-velocity vacuum lines we're setting up. We're going to punch a few pilot bores to create localized sumps, drop the intake hoses, and let the machines do the heavy lifting. We'll have this acreage viable in 72 hours. Arthur wanted to argue. He wanted to tell Davis about the stories his grandfather told, about the time they tried to dig a deep well in the lower 40 in 1938 and hit water so angry it blew the drilling rig off its foundation. But he looked at the sheer scale of the operation, the massive semi-trailers unloading pumps the size of small cars, the thick black hoses unspooling like massive serpents across his flooded fields, the technicians shouting jargon over the roar of the diesels. He was an old man with an old farm, and the world had moved on to data streams and heavy horsepower. He swallowed his pride, nodded slowly, and retreated to the porch to watch the modern world try to conquer nature. By noon, the operation was in full swing. The noise was deafening. 4 massive industrial pumps roared with mechanical fury, vibrating the ground beneath Arthur's feet, even from 50 yards away. The thick black hoses pulsed and writhed as thousands of gallons of murky water were sucked from the submerged fields and fired through a temporary pipeline toward the northern ridge. For the first few hours, it looked like a miracle. Davis stood by his command vehicle, occasionally pointing at his tablet and nodding approvingly to his foreman. Arthur watched the wooden post in his garden. By late afternoon, the waterline had actually dropped 3 inches. The tops of his ruined wheat stalks began to peek through the muddy surface, looking like drowned reeds. "See that, Mr. Blackwood?" Davis shouted, walking over to the porch, holding a steaming cup of coffee from a thermos. "It's just a matter of volume and velocity. Math always wins." Arthur didn't smile. He looked at the water being discharged far in the distance. "Pumps are running hot," he observed quietly. "They're pulling up heavy silt. You're sucking the topsoil right off the bedrock." "Acceptable losses for rapid recovery," Davis replied smoothly. "Once the standing water is cleared, the soil will stabilize." But Arthur felt a deep, unsettling vibration in the soles of his boots. It wasn't just the rumble of the diesel engines, it was something deeper, a structural shivering in the earth itself. He walked down to the edge of the receding water and crouched, dipping his fingers into the muck. The water was swirling strangely, forming tiny, localized eddies that defied the pull of the massive intake hoses. "You need to shut them down," Arthur said, standing up and turning to Davis. The urgency in his voice made the contractor pause. "The draw is too fast. You're pulling the surface water, but you're creating a vacuum above the shale. The earth underneath is shifting." Davis sighed, a sound of profound corporate exhaustion. "Mr. Blackwood, my instruments are green across the board. The pressure differentials are well within safety margins." "Your instruments can't feel the ground," Arthur barked, his temper finally flaring. "I'm telling you, there is artesian pressure under that shale. If you keep force-pulling the water table this fast, you're going to crack the seal." Before Davis could issue another patronizing rebuttal, a radio on his shoulder buzzed frantically. "Davis, this is Team 2 at the central sump. We're getting a massive pressure spike on intake 3. The pilot bore is cavitating." Davis frowned, grabbing the radio. "Clarify, Team 2. Are you clogged? Reverse the flow and blow out the intake." "Negative, negative. It's not a clog," the voice crackled, laced with sudden panic. "The ground is dropping. We're losing the bore casing." Arthur didn't wait. He started running, as best as an old man in heavy boots could run through thick mud, toward the center of the flooded field, where a cluster of technicians were standing around a heavy drilling rig used to sink the sump pipes. He was halfway there when the earth gave way. It wasn't a slow sinkhole. It was a violent, catastrophic collapse. With a sound like a muffled explosion, a circular section of the field, roughly 40 feet across, simply vanished, swallowing the drilling rig and 2 of the massive intake hoses. The technicians scrambled backward, screaming as the ground dissolved beneath their feet. For a terrifying second, there was a massive void, a gaping black hole in the center of the floodwaters. Then, the physics that Arthur had warned about asserted themselves with terrifying force. The massive industrial pumps had created a temporary vacuum in the topsoil, while simultaneously fracturing the fragile, ancient layer of shale below. Beneath that shale, a pressurized aquifer, bloated by weeks of rain, found the weakness. A geyser of black, freezing water, thick with pulverized rock and ancient mud, erupted from the sinkhole. It shot 20 feet into the air, a roaring column of subterranean fury. The water didn't just fill the hole. It surged outward with incredible violence, creating a tidal wave of heavy, viscous mud that swept across the field, instantly undoing hours of pumping. The force of the eruption caught one of the giant diesel pumps. The 10-ton machine groaned, tilted, and then was violently shoved sideways by the surging water, its engine stalling with a horrific screech of grinding metal as water flooded its intake manifold. "Shut it down! Shut everything down!" Davis was screaming into his radio, sprinting toward the chaos, his pristine uniform quickly plastered in flying black mud. "Kill the mains! Evacuate the perimeter!" The remaining pumps were frantically powered off. The sudden silence from the engines only amplified the terrifying roar of the artesian geyser. It spewed relentlessly, flooding the field not just with the existing surface water, but with millions of gallons of ancient, pressurized groundwater. Arthur stood knee-deep in the surging tide, watching the disaster unfold. The water level rushed past his morning notch on the fence post in minutes, climbing higher than it had been before FloodTech arrived. The field wasn't just flooded anymore, it was hydraulically connected to a subterranean lake. By nightfall, the geyser had subsided into a massive roiling upwelling, a permanent bubbling spring in the center of his ruined farm. The FloodTech crew, soaked, exhausted, and demoralized, spent the evening desperately winching their remaining equipment out of the rapidly expanding quagmire. The mobile command center had to be towed backward up the county road to avoid being swamped. The command tent was a scene of grim defeat. High-powered LED lanterns cast harsh white light over tables covered in wet topographical maps and ruined tablets. Samuel Davis stood at the head of the table, his earlier arrogance entirely washed away. He looked pale, staring at the telemetry on a surviving laptop. Arthur stood in the doorway of the tent, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He didn't say, "I told you so." The devastation of his land was too complete for petty vindication. Davis looked up, meeting Arthur's eyes. The contractor swallowed hard. "The geological survey was flawed," Davis said, his voice flat, stripped of all its corporate polish. "We didn't anticipate the hydrostatic pressure beneath the shale. The pilot bore acted like a release valve." "I know," Arthur said simply. "What now?" Davis shook his head, looking back at the screen. "We ran the models. The breach is too wide, and the pressure from the aquifer is equalizing with the surface floodwaters. We can't pump it out. Every gallon we pull off the top is instantly replaced by a gallon from below. It's a closed loop now." "So you fixed the breach?" Arthur demanded, stepping into the tent. "You plug the hole you made." "We can't," a muddy engineer sitting next to Davis interjected quietly. "To pour a hydrostatic concrete plug, we'd need to drop the water level by at least 10 feet to get the heavy equipment in. We can't drop the water level because of the breach. It's a catch-22. Sir, the equipment required to fight that kind of upward pressure, it doesn't exist outside of offshore oil drilling. The cost would be astronomical. Millions." Davis stood up, taking a deep breath and straightening his soiled jacket. He picked up a plastic clipboard holding a stack of damp, official-looking forms. He walked over to Arthur. The air in the tent was heavy, suffocating. "Mr. Blackwood," Davis said, adopting a formal, detached tone that felt like a death sentence. "FloodTech is officially declaring this sector an unrecoverable zone. We are terminating operations." Arthur stared at him. "You're giving up. You broke my land, and you're just driving away." "I am incredibly sorry, sir, truly, but from an engineering and financial standpoint, this field is a total loss. The county will be notified. We've stabilized the perimeter to ensure the upwelling doesn't threaten the town, but this basin—" Davis gestured vaguely toward the dark, churning water outside. "This is going to be a permanent wetland, a marsh." He held out the clipboard. "These are the insurance claim forms and the county relocation protocols. FloodTech's liability insurance will cover the loss of the property and the current year's crop yield at market value. You will be compensated." "Compensated?" Arthur whispered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at the clipboard, refusing to take it. 3 generations of Blackwoods pulled stumps, moved rocks, and fought the river to make this land. My grandfather is buried in the cemetery on the high hill. You think a check from a liability firm buys that?" Davis lowered the clipboard, looking genuinely pained but resolute. "Mr. Blackwood, physics is physics. The water won. There is no machine on earth that can fix this now. The best thing you can do is sign the papers, take the money, and find higher ground." Arthur didn't take the clipboard. He turned slowly and walked out of the bright, sterile light of the command tent, back into the driving rain and the darkness. He walked past the massive, silent diesel pumps, now just useless metal monoliths, sinking slowly into the mud. He heard the distant, continuous churning of the water welling up from the deep earth, a sound that felt like the land itself bleeding out. He waded back toward his farmhouse, the water now high enough to reach the bottom step of his porch. The FloodTech trucks were already beginning to roll out, their headlights cutting through the rain as they retreated, abandoning the siege. They were leaving him with a destroyed farm, a check he didn't want, and an impossible lake. But as Arthur reached his porch, he didn't go inside. He stopped, his eyes tracing the shoreline of the rising water, moving past the garden, past the flooded barn, toward a small, overgrown rise near the old property line. Standing on a concrete plinth, surrounded by high weeds and half submerged in the flood, was a shape cast in heavy iron. It was an old manual water pump, a massive, archaic thing with a long, counterweighted lever arm. It hadn't been used since the electrical lines were run out to the valley in 1946. It was rusted, forgotten, a relic of a time before diesel engines and satellite topography. Arthur stared at the rusted silhouette through the rain. He remembered his grandfather's hands on that heavy iron handle. He remembered the specific grinding rhythm, the smell of grease, and the stories of the deep, cold water that slept beneath the rock. Davis had said there was no machine on Earth that could fix this. Davis relied on algorithms, but Arthur knew the land. And he knew that sometimes when the modern world breaks something, you have to look backward to find the cure. The receding taillights of the FloodTech convoy painted streaks of angry red across the surface of the drowned farm. The heavy rumble of their diesel engines faded into the steady, oppressive drumming of the rain. Arthur Blackwood was alone again, left with a ruined field, a gushing subterranean geyser, and a stack of unsigned corporate surrender documents sitting on his kitchen table. He didn't go inside. Instead, he waded through the knee-deep water, the cold biting through his heavy wool trousers, moving steadily toward the slight rise at the eastern edge of the property. The water here was shallower, lapping at the concrete plinth that anchored the old iron pump. It was a monstrous piece of Depression-era engineering, a deep-draw walking beam pump installed by his grandfather in 1938. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, its cast-iron body was heavily pitted and scarred by decades of oxidation, the dark red rust flaking off like scabs. The massive, counterweighted lever arm, polished smooth at the grip by generations of calloused hands, pointed toward the gray sky like a petrified limb. It had been obsolete since the county ran electrical lines out to the valley, left as a stubborn monument to a harder time. Arthur reached out and laid a gloved hand on the cold iron. It felt immovable, fused shut by time and neglect, but Arthur knew the anatomy of this beast better than he knew his own failing joints. He knew it didn't rely on spinning impellers or high-velocity vacuums. It relied on absolute, unforgiving mechanical leverage and a perfect airtight seal. He turned and slogged toward the old tractor shed, a dilapidated structure that had mercifully been built on the highest grade of the farm. The floor was damp, but the workbench was above the waterline. He rummaged through heavy wooden drawers, smelling of creosote, mice, and ancient dust. From the back of the bottom drawer, he pulled out a heavy canvas roll. Inside were the specialized spanner wrenches his grandfather had ordered from a catalog in Chicago. Heavy iron tools designed specifically for the pump's oversized, non-standard bolts. Next, he found a sealed glass mason jar sitting on a high shelf. Inside was a thick, yellowish paste, a mixture of rendered tallow, beeswax, and graphite powder. It was the only lubricant heavy enough to withstand the immense hydraulic pressures of the deep well without washing away. Beside it lay a spool of thick, tar-impregnated hemp rope and a bundle of dried, cured cowhide. Armed with his grandfather's archaic toolkit, Arthur returned to the deluge. He set a waterproof lantern on the concrete plinth, its harsh white light carving out a small sanctuary of illumination in the driving rain. The first task was breaking the rust seal on the pump head. He fit the largest spanner around the main access bolt, leaned his entire body weight onto the handle, and strained until his vision went white at the edges. With a sound like a rifle shot, the rust bond shattered, and the bolt groaned backward. It took him nearly an hour of agonizing, knuckle-busting labor just to remove the cast-iron housing and expose the internal piston cylinder. Inside, it was a mess of dried rot. The heavy leather cup washer, designed to expand against the cylinder walls and pull the vacuum, was shriveled and hard as bone. The hemp packing around the drive rod had disintegrated into powder. Arthur worked with a slow, methodical reverence. He scraped away the decayed material with a pocket knife. He took a fresh piece of cowhide, soaking it in the freezing floodwater to make it pliable, then meticulously molded it around the heavy brass piston head, securing it with a brass retaining ring. He packed the drive rod gland with fresh tarred hemp, tamping it down tightly with a brass punch. Finally, he coated the entire assembly, the cylinder walls, and the pivot joints with thick, heavy layers of the tallow graphite grease. Reassembling the pump head was a brutal test of his remaining strength. He had to hoist the 30-pound iron casting into place while aligning the massive bolts, his boots slipping on the algae-slicked concrete. By the time the final bolt was wrenched tight, the sky had begun to lighten into a bruised, miserable gray. The rain had finally slowed to a persistent drizzle. Arthur's chest heaved, his breath pluming in the frigid air. His hands were bleeding, the knuckles raw and coated in black grease. He gripped the long, heavy lever arm. It was time for the prime. He threw his weight backward. The iron joints shrieked, a high-pitched scream of metal protesting decades of slumber. The lever moved down a fraction of an inch, then stopped, locking up against the immense friction of the new, tight leather seal. Arthur adjusted his footing, took a deep breath, and threw his entire body mass into the pull. Clack! Groan. The lever descended. He pushed it back up. It was exhausting, agonizing work. The pump was designed to draw water from an aquifer 200 feet below the bedrock, requiring immense force for a single stroke. He pumped for 10 minutes, his shoulders burning, his lungs burning, nothing but the wet, sucking sound of the dry piston dragging against the cylinder walls. The sound of an approaching engine broke his concentration. Crawling down the muddy remnants of the driveway was a lone FloodTech Command SUV. It came to a halt near the porch, and Samuel Davis stepped out. The senior project manager looked haggard, his uniform rumpled, holding a plastic folder to his chest to protect it from the drizzle. He had returned for the official signatures. The county required them to process the disaster write-off. Davis looked around, confused by Arthur's absence from the house. Then he spotted the solitary figure out in the water, heaving against a rusted piece of scrap metal. Davis let out a long, weary sigh, a plume of condensation escaping his lips. He picked his way carefully along the higher ground of the fence line, trying to keep the mud off his boots until he was standing a few yards from the pump's concrete base. "Mr. Blackwood," Davis called out, his voice a mixture of pity and intense exasperation. He raised his free hand in a broad, pleading gesture. "Please, Arthur, look, I know this is devastating, but you are exhausting yourself for absolutely nothing." Arthur didn't stop. He was trapped in the rhythm now, fighting the resistance of the deep earth. Heave, squeal, push, groan. "Mr. Blackwood, stop," Davis said, his voice taking on a sharper, authoritative edge. He stepped closer. "That relic isn't going to do anything. You're just pulling a vacuum against solid rock. The ground is hydraulically locked. My machines couldn't break the equilibrium, and they have 10,000 times the horsepower of that antique." Arthur paused at the top of a stroke, leaning heavily on the wooden handle, chest heaving. He glared down at Davis. "Your machines," Arthur panted. "Pull from the top. They suck blindly. They don't know the land." Arthur gripped the handle again. He felt a subtle change in the resistance, a heavy, damp solidity in the pull. The leather washer had seated perfectly. The vacuum was absolute. "And what exactly does that thing know?" Davis scoffed, gesturing to the iron pump. "It's physics, Arthur. You can't outpump a pressurized artesian breech with a manual lever." "I'm not pumping the breech," Arthur grunted. He threw his weight back in a massive fluid arc. Deep within the iron belly of the pump, there was a profound, bass-heavy thud. It wasn't a metallic clank, but the sound of an immense weight shifting. The entire concrete plinth shuddered. On the next upward stroke, the resistance was suddenly, violently massive. Arthur's boots skidded on the wet concrete as he fought to pull the lever down. It felt as though he were trying to lift a small car. "It's caught!" Arthur rasped, his eyes widening. He leaned his entire body back, using gravity to force the lever down. From the heavy cast-iron spout extending over the floodwaters, a thick, wet cough echoed. A gout of mud and rust blasted out, splattering into the water below. Then came the second stroke. As Arthur forced the lever down again, a solid, unbroken stream of water erupted from the spout. It hit the surface of the flood with the force of a fire hose. Davis instinctively stepped back, shielding his face. When he lowered his arm, his eyes locked onto the discharge. He froze, his professional certainty shattering in an instant. The water rocketing out of the old iron pump wasn't the murky, brown, silt-choked floodwater that covered the farm. It was crystalline. It was pure, icy, transparent water, so clear it carried a faint bluish tint in the gray morning light. It smelled of deep minerals and cold stone, entirely devoid of the rot of the surface flood. "What is that?" Davis stammered, staring at the pristine torrent. "Where is that coming from? The intake is submerged in the flood." "The intake for this pump," Arthur said, fighting to maintain the agonizing rhythm, his voice tight with exertion, "is a steel pipe driven 250 feet straight down, cased in concrete through the shale. It bypasses the surface table entirely. Arthur pumped again, the heavy stream of pure water tearing into the muddy lake. "You're drawing from the lower aquifer," Davis said, his engineering mind racing to catch up. He looked out toward the center of the field, where the massive bubbling upwelling of the geyser his machines had created was still churning. But you're just adding volume to the surface. You're making the flood worse." "Look at the breach, son," Arthur commanded, nodding toward the center of the field as he heaved the lever. Davis turned. He squinted through the mist. The violent, roiling dome of muddy water that had been erupting from the earth since yesterday was shrinking. The furious bubbling had subsided into a troubled swirl. "I don't understand," Davis muttered, looking between the clear water blasting from the pump and the dying geyser. "The hydrostatic pressure—" "You opened an artery," Arthur grunted, his face pale with strain. "You cracked the shale and gave all that high-pressure deep water a path to the surface. Your surface pumps couldn't beat the pressure from below." Arthur paused for a split second, taking a gasping breath before resuming the stroke. "This well," Arthur continued, "taps into the same deep aquifer, but miles downstream of the pressure dome. By drawing water up through this restricted pipe, I'm creating a massive localized draw. I'm dropping the pressure in the deep vein." Davis's eyes widened in sudden, profound realization. The clipboard slipped from his hand, splashing into the shallow water. "You're relieving the hydrostatic head," Davis whispered, his voice full of awe. "You're pulling the pressure away from the breach. If the pressure below the shale drops below the weight of the surface water, then the surface water stops coming up," Arthur finished, pulling the lever with grim satisfaction. "And if I drop the pressure deep enough, gravity takes over. The floodwater will drain back down into the hole you made, equalizing the aquifer." Davis stared at the old man, his mind reeling at the elegant, brutal simplicity of the solution. It wasn't about moving the surface volume over a hill. It was about manipulating the deep earth pressure to make the water swallow itself. It was a geological judo throw that none of his sophisticated software models had been programmed to consider, because they only measured the problem from the top down. "But the volume," Davis said, shaking his head. "You have to maintain this draw pressure continuously. The moment you stop, the aquifer will repressurize, and the geyser will start again. You can't pump fast enough or long enough by yourself to drain 100 acres. "I know," Arthur said. His arms were trembling visibly now. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the agonizing reality of a 78-year-old body pushing past its absolute limits. His stroke rate was already slowing. "But I'm not by myself." A low rumble echoed down the county road. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of FloodTech diesels. It was the heavy, uneven growl of an old Ford F-250 with a rusted muffler. The truck splashed through the remaining water on the driveway and parked aggressively next to Davis's SUV. The door threw open, and out stepped Elias Thorne, an 80-year-old neighboring dairy farmer, wearing yellow slickers and carrying a heavy thermos. Behind him, another set of headlights cut through the gloom. A beat-up Subaru pulled up, depositing two younger men, the Miller brothers from the hardware store in town. Elias trudged through the water, ignoring Davis completely. He stepped up onto the concrete plinth, looking at Arthur's trembling arms and the steady stream of clear water. "Saw the white trucks tuck tail and run last night, Artie," Elias said, his voice a deep, gravelly boom. "Figured they broke something they couldn't buy their way out of." Elias set his thermos down, unbuttoned his slicker, and stepped up beside Arthur. He laid his massive, arthritis-gnarled hands on the iron lever right above Arthur's. "Let me take the left side," Elias grunted. "You're losing your cadence." Arthur nodded, too exhausted to speak, and shifted his grip. Together, the two old men pulled the heavy iron lever. The output of pure water surged, hitting the flood with renewed violence. The Miller brothers waded over, shedding their coats. "We got shifts organized, Mr. Blackwood," the older Miller brother said. "Half the town saw the geyser blow yesterday. When we saw your light out here this morning, well, we know what this pump does. My dad told me about 1965. We brought sandwiches and coffee. Half the volunteer fire department is on their way." Davis stood in the muddy water, entirely forgotten, watching a miracle of archaic mechanics and sheer human stubbornness unfold. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy, waterproof satellite radio. "Dispatch, this is Davis," he said, his voice quiet. "Go ahead, Davis. Are the release forms signed? Have you cleared the perimeter?" "Negative on the forms," Davis replied, watching Elias Thorne seamlessly take over the pumping rhythm, his massive shoulders rolling with the effort as Arthur finally stepped back to catch his breath. "And cancel the total loss report on the Blackwood sector. Send a drone back up. Tell engineering to open a fresh topography channel and monitor the breach telemetry. Davis, we declared that zone unrecoverable. The models show. The models are blind to the deep table, Davis interrupted, a rare smile touching the corner of his mouth. Just send the drone. You're going to want to record this. We're getting a lesson in applied geology. The day bled into a grueling, relentless night. The rain stopped entirely by noon, replaced by a biting, clear cold. The wooden platform around the old iron pump became a staging ground for a desperate, primitive battle against the water. Men and women from the surrounding valley arrived in a steady stream. They parked their trucks along the flooded road, bringing floodlights, portable generators, thermoses of black coffee, and hot chili in slow cookers. They formed a rotation, 2 people at a time on the heavy iron lever, working in furious 15-minute bursts to maintain the relentless, agonizing draw on the deep aquifer. The rhythmic clack-squeal groan of the pump became the heartbeat of the valley, echoing over the still water. Arthur sat in a camp chair on the porch, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, sipping scalding coffee. He was exhausted to the marrow of his bones, but his eyes never left the center of the field. Samuel Davis hadn't left. He had set his tablet up on the hood of his SUV, the screen glowing brightly in the dark. A small FloodTech drone hovered high above the farm, beaming down thermal and topographical data. At 2:00 a.m., Davis walked over to the porch. The crispness of his uniform was a memory. He was covered in mud, smelling of diesel and sweat, having taken 3 shifts on the pump himself. "Look at this," Davis said softly, turning the tablet toward Arthur. The screen showed a heat map of the field. The bright red bloom of the underground geyser, which had been expanding for 24 hours, was gone. In its place was a dark blue depression. "The hydrostatic pressure below the shale has dropped by 40%, Davis explained, his voice hushed with reverence. "The localized draw from your well is working like a massive pressure relief valve. The surface water." He pointed out toward the darkness. "It's reversing flow." Arthur looked out. Under the harsh glare of the portable floodlights, the change was undeniable. The wooden fence post in the garden was fully exposed. The water wasn't just receding, it was swirling with a slow, deliberate purpose toward the center of the field, being sucked down into the very breach that had created the disaster. The weight of the millions of gallons of surface water was now greater than the depleted pressure of the deep aquifer, forcing the flood back into the earth. By the time the sun began to crest over the eastern ridge, casting long golden shadows across the valley, the battle was won. The lake was gone. In its place was a vast, devastated expanse of thick, brown mud. The stalks of winter wheat lay flattened and coated in silt, but they were there. The land had been battered, suffocated, and nearly broken, but it was land again. The breach in the center of the field was nothing more than a wide, shallow depression of cracked mud, the earth having sealed itself as the pressure equalized. The old iron pump stood silent on its concrete plinth, its handle resting in the down position. Around it, 6 exhausted neighbors lay sleeping in the cabs of their trucks or wrapped in blankets on the porch. Arthur walked slowly out onto the muddy field. His boots sank deep into the sludge, but it was solid earth beneath. He bent down, grabbing a handful of the wet soil, feeling the grit and the cold reality of it. It would take a year to restore the pH balance. It would take massive amounts of fertilizer to replace the topsoil that had washed away, but it was his dirt. It hadn't become a marsh. He heard footsteps squelching through the mud behind him. Samuel Davis walked up, holding a steaming cup of coffee. He offered it to Arthur. Arthur took it, wrapping his raw, grease-stained hands around the warm ceramic. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Blackwood," Davis said quietly, looking out over the ruined but recovering farm. "I trusted a satellite scan over a man who knows the depth of his own dirt. We nearly destroyed your legacy because we thought we were smarter than the ground we were standing on." Arthur took a slow sip of the coffee. The morning air was sharp and clean. "Satellites are good for seeing what's on top, son," Arthur said, his voice raspy but steady. He looked back at the rusted iron pump, catching the first rays of the morning sun. "But when you want to move the earth, you have to know what's holding it up from underneath." Davis nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded plastic-wrapped release forms he had tried to force Arthur to sign the day before. He looked at them for a second, then deliberately tore them in half, shoving the pieces back into his pocket. "I'll have a crew out here tomorrow with a backhoe and a load of specialized agricultural lime," Davis said, his tone no longer that of a corporate manager, but of a partner. "We'll help you till this silt under, on FloodTech's dime. Call it a consultation fee for the engineering lesson." Arthur looked at the younger man, seeing the genuine shift in his eyes. He didn't offer a smile, but the rigid set of his jaw softened. "Just make sure they bring shovels, Davis," Arthur replied, turning back to look at his fields. "Machines break. Dirt is forever.